Chapter 19. Alice's Evidence. "Here!" cried Alice, forgetting in her excitement how large she had grown in the last few minutes. She jumped up so fast that she knocked over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, spilling the jurors onto the heads of the crowd below. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she cried, picking them up as quickly as she could. "The trials cannot proceed," said the king in a grave voice, "until all the jurors are back in their proper places. All of them," he repeated, looking hard at Alice. Alice noticed that, in her haste, she had put Bill the Lizard in upside down. The poor little thing was waving its tail about, unable to move. She plucked it out and put it back in the box right side up. As soon as the jurors had recovered from the shock of their fall, and their slates and chalk had been found and handed back to them, they set to work writing out a history of the accident. All, that is, except Bill the Lizard, who seemed too stunned to do anything but sit with his mouth open, gazing at the courtroom roof. "What do you know about this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatsoever?" said the king. "Nothing whatsoever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jurors. They were beginning to write this on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course," he said. "Of course. Unimportant, I meant," said the king, then went on to himself. "Important. Unimportant. Unimportant. Important," as if he were trying to decide which word sounded best. Alice noticed that some of the jurors wrote important and some wrote unimportant. "It doesn't matter either way," she thought. At this moment the king, who had been busily writing in his notebook, called out, "Silence!" and read from his book, "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high must leave the court." Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," she said. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," said the queen. "Well, I won't go," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice, "not 42. The king turned pale and shut his notebook. "What is your verdict?" he asked the jury, in a low, trembling voice. "There's more evidence to come, your majesty," said the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just arrived." "What's in it?" asked the queen. "It seems to be a letter," the rabbit replied. "Written by the prisoner, the knave, to somebody." "Of course it was," said the king, "unless it was written to nobody, which isn't unusual." "Nothing is unusual here," thought Alice. "Who is it addressed to?" asked one of the jurors. "It isn't addressed at all," said the White Rabbit. "There's nothing written on the outside." He unfolded the paper, then said, "It isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses." "Are they in the prisoner's handwriting?" asked another juror. "No," said the White Rabbit, "and that's the oddest thing about it." The jurors looked puzzled. "He must have copied someone else's handwriting," said the king. "Please, your majesty," said the knave, who had remained silent until this point. "I didn't write it, and they can't prove I did. There's no name signed at the end." "If you didn't sign it," said the king, "that only makes the matter worse. You must have been up to no good, or you would have signed your name like an honest man." The court burst into applause at this comment. It was the first clever thing the king had said all day. "That proves his guilt, of course," said the queen. "It proves no such thing," said Alice. "You don't even know what the verses are about." "That's true," said the king, and turned to the rabbit. "Read them." The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. "Where shall I begin, your majesty?" he asked. "Begin at the beginning," the king said gravely, "and go on until you come to the end. Then stop." So the rabbit read, "They told me you had been to her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. He sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her 1, they gave him 2, you gave us 3 or more. They all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. My idea was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me." "That is the most important piece of evidence we have heard yet," said the king, rubbing his hands. "Nonsense," said Alice. "If anyone can explain it, I'll give him 6pence. I don't believe it means anything at all." She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting. The jurors all wrote on their slates, She doesn't believe it means anything at all, but none of them seemed to understand what was going on. If it doesn't mean anything, said the king, that saves us a lot of trouble, because then we don't have to figure it out. Yet, he went on, spreading out the odd verses on his knee and looking at them with one eye. I seem to see some meaning in this after all. Said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you? He asked the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like I can swim? He said. As he was made of cardboard, the answer was clearly no. All right, so far, said the king. Now, we know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. I gave her 1, they gave him 2. That must be what he did with the tarts. But look at the rest, said Alice. It says, they all returned from him to you. And there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. Nothing can be clearer than that. Now, before she had this fit. You've never had a fit, have you, my dear? He asked the queen. Never, said the queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at Bill the Lizard as she spoke. Then these words don't fit you, said the king, looking round the court with a smile. There was a dead silence. It's a pun. I just made a joke, said the king, sounding offended. So everybody laughed. Let the jury consider its verdict, he went on. No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. That's ridiculous, said Alice, quite loudly. You can't have the sentence first. How unfair. Hold your tongue, said the queen, turning purple. I won't, Alice retorted. Off with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. Alice, who had grown to her full size by this time, towered over everyone in the room. Who's afraid of you? She asked. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this, the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. Alice gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off. Suddenly, she found herself lying on the river bank with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered from the trees onto Alice's face. Wake up, Alice, said her sister. What a long sleep you've had. Oh my, said Alice. I've had such a curious dream, she told her sister, as well as she could remember. All the strange adventures that you've just been reading about. When she finished, her sister gave her a kiss and said, It was a curious dream, dear, but now run into your tea. It's getting late. So Alice got up and ran off, thinking as she ran, what a wonderful dream it had been. The end.